So welcome everyone to this, I think it's our fourth Linnean Lens event, where we take an object in our collection and we focus on it through both a PowerPoint presentation, but also through an external viewer that we have in work. And today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Mark Spencer, who is he's our honorary botany curator here at the Linnean Society. So he's in charge of both herbariums that we have. He's an independent consultant, but was formerly a senior botany curator at the Natural History Museum, in charge of the historic collections, British and Irish herbarium for over a decade. And I'm going to say this, Mark is currently engaged in 2 historic botany research projects. The first on the plants cultivated in Fulham Palace during the life of Henry Compton, Bishop of London. And secondly, the herbarium of Reverend Adam Budle. Is that how you pronounce it?
Budle, as in Bodleian.
Of course,
yes.
Of course, I should have known this. And today, Mark is going to talk to us about Carl Linnaeus Species Plantarum. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Isabel. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully that is working for everybody. It would help if I put on the full screen, naughty me. We've got a couple of new bits of kit which I'm not used to using, so hopefully I shall keep on control of everything. So this talk today is going to be focusing upon one of, the world's most important scientists, our hero Carl Linnaeus, but also, naughty me, put on the auto start on there, but also upon one of his key and fundamentally important works, Species Plantarum. Now, this particular work is of key importance to us botanists because it is what we refer to as the starting point for modern botanical nomenclature. And so it is key for us in terms of actually how we manage and organize and understand the naming of nature, in this particular case, plants. So Species Plantarum sits along Systema Naturae as being fundamentally important works in the history of documenting the diversity of nature. Now, it is fair to say that Linnaeus did not spring out of the ether anew with all of these wonderful ideas. He was a person who was working in a period of great scientific endeavor and exploration, and his part is in actually compiling and collating, amongst other things. So he himself sits upon the shoulders of many other people who were important and great in their own time. For example, the Bauhan brothers, who I'm going to mention momentarily, because it is often said that Linnaeus created the naming system that we use today. He's essentially, it's fair to say, the person who formalized and established the structures, but many people before him, including the Bauhans, were actually working on the challenge of how do we take this diverse language that we used in science to create a naming system that was stable and useful. And one of the things about names is that they're more than just a scientific affectation. They're not a way of us just feeling that we can create something Latinesque and pretty. They are fundamentally important in terms of us being able to establish a connection through the natural world, because it's by the process of giving a name that we can actually start to add information, both within a library, for example, or within the context of our own personal understanding of the natural world, connect that name with pieces of information about the natural world, whether it be ecology, biodiversity, biochemistry, etc., or increasingly as we face the risks of our planet, such things as extinction and environmental change. So a name is so much more than just a label. It is a hook upon which we can put much of the information about the natural world upon. So the binomial system, as it is now currently known, is a system which many of us are familiar with. You know, we ourselves are called Homo sapiens. And this binomial system, as I say, was formalized by Linnaeus in these two key works, Systema Naturae and Species Plantarum. They themselves were part of a much wider corpus of scientific works that Linnaeus wrote throughout his life. So they themselves are intimately connected with his other scientific literature. But just to show you in itself, one of the wonderful things about the binomial system itself is actually the simplicity and ease of access of that information. So this delightful plant, spurge laurel, Daphne laureola, is a fairly common and reasonably widespread plant of ancient woodlands across southern England and various parts of Western Europe, and is named Daphne laureola and was given that name by Linnaeus in 1753 in Species Plantarum. Now, prior to Linnaeus establishing this standardized naming system, this particular plant came with a plethora of names depending upon the scientific tradition that you were following. And they could be very diverse and very, very different. And here's a small snippet of the variations you could have for this one species. So depending upon your academic discipline or your background and origins, principally within Europe, you could be calling it Daphne racemis axillaribus folius lanceolatus glabris, or Daphne racemis lateralibus folius lanceolatus integris, or Laureola sempervirens floriviridi quisbardum laureola mass, or just laureola. Now that in itself is clearly quite a daunting and complex presentation of information, and therefore the creation of the binomial and the establishment of the binomial system helped ease the complexity. And so in itself, the binomial system is fundamentally important in actually gatewaying access to information. Now, we are incredibly lucky within the Linnaean Society that we are the guardians of much of Linnaeus's personal collections and materials. Some of his collections were lost for various reasons historically, but we have here in Piccadilly, in our vault in the basement, some of the most important scientific works in the history of modern biological science. So this image in front of you shows you the Linnean library. So up here, if I move my cursor around, these are his own personal copies of his publications and those of his students. If you go further around the room, there are also examples of his own personal library from other authors, such as the Bauhan brothers. Beneath that, and to the right, there are the remnants of his insect and shell and fish collections. But the bit that gets me personally deeply excited are these brown paper bundles with the Linnaean plant specimens in. And the Linnaean herbarium, this is the modern representation of his personal collection, was made through his life from about the 1730s to shortly before his death in the 1770s, is the compilation of his exploration of the natural world and plants in particular. Each one of these bundles contains plant specimens such as these ones on top. What is really, really important about this presentation is that this collection is arranged pretty much with some changes made for various reasons shortly after his death by his son, and after it came to this country, it is pretty much entirely as it was through this structure that he used in his life. So this is an exceptionally important example of how a scientific connection has kept its physical integrity as a series of objects. And that itself is very, very important. We often think in science of objects as being, the thing that is important. But I can assure you, as a museum curator, we're also increasingly passionate about how the information is managed and organized. So these specimens are arranged following Linnaeus's sexual system, as was referred to. Now, the Linnaean sexual system is actually, in essence, quite a simple system. And what it required is for the observer to look at a flower and be able to count the male organs and the female organs. And therefore, if you had one male organ and one female organ, it would be monoandria. monogynia, and therefore that provided you with the sequence by which you could put your specimens into your series. So this system was very fundamentally important for Linnaeus personally, but it's also really important to recognize that actually he recognized its artificiality. He says very importantly in one of his books, Philosophia Botanica, that this is essentially an information retrieval system, and actually what is desirable is a way of classifying nature to reflect naturalness. In some respects, you can see that he's starting to grasp some of the ideas around how diversity of life relates to each other, and therefore ultimately, even though the word is not in his mind, potentially evolution. It'll always be one of the great intangibles for us, is that obviously we cannot risk putting thoughts and ideas into the minds of people that have gone before us. But it's fair to say that Linnaeus, along with many other people at that time, was grasping that relationship between an artificial system and actually reflecting the diversity of nature. So this system is avowedly artificial, but it is very useful and utilitarian. So this next slide is to show you actually how Linnaeus's collections are actually in many ways the forebears of a modern herbarium. First of all, it's probably fair to say, what is a herbarium? A herbarium is essentially a dried collection of plants. I often described it as being somewhat like a library. It is a plant library describing the origins and diversity of plant life. And in this particular case, what we have here on the left is a modern herbarium specimen. This is collected by myself in Charles Darwin's backyard down in Kent about a decade or so ago. And this exemplifies many of the differences, but also the commonalities between collecting wild plants in the era of Linnaeus and in the modern era. So in both cases, these plants are collected and they're dried as quickly as we possibly can without cooking them, and they're mounted on paper. And that is done in the case of Linnaeus using things like fish and animal glue. We use various conservation grade glues to stick the plant to the sheet, and in some institutions they little paper straps. So this is a dried specimen mounted on a piece of paper. A modern collection will also have on top of that things like a capsule, this paper envelope here, and that's where you can put things like seed, fruits, and other things that may become detached from the specimen. There's a unique identifier, because if you lose your specimen or you need some way of recording to it, this helps you find it. So at the Natural History Museum, where I used to work, we had some 5 million or so plant specimens, and therefore having a unique identifier to track where the object is potentially very, very valuable, because it is incredibly easy to lose them. Down below, we have the collection information. This is the where it was collected, when it was collected, and by who, as well as in some cases more detailed information about ecology. These two other objects are on here are purely for imaging reasons. They're put on as actually as part of the photographic process and to denote a bit of ownership. Now, the Linnaean specimen you can see here on the right-hand side is very, very different. What you can see here is a plant specimen with none of the information that I've talked about, or virtually none of the information that I talk about it. And this causes many modern biologists or many observers to think that there is no information attached to that. But that's because the information relating to this specimen is elsewhere. So this number up here is not a Linnaean cataloguing number. This was put on in the 20th century as for us to ensure that we could manage the collections. Down here is the Linnaean cataloguing system. So here you have below the specimen, you have the number 1, which I'll explain what this number means in a moment. And also then is a specific epithet, as we call it now, or as Linnaeus initially described it, the nomen trivialia, because it was the trivial reduction of these long strings of polynomials, these long scientific names. So this is the nomen trivialia and the species plantarum number, which is very, very important. So the objects are fundamentally very different. Now, I'm going to very quickly, am I going to do it yet? Yes, I'm going to carry on. Just to carry on explaining a little bit more about the influence of Linnaeus's sexual system. This plate here was created by Georg Dionysius Eret, who was an early admirer of Linnaeus in the 1730s, and this was reprinted in Genera Plantarum, which was one of the precursor works for what ultimately became Species Plantarum. Now, one of the things to bear in mind about this is that the naming system, or rather the idea, apologies, of describing the idea that plants had sexuality was deeply controversial at the time. And Linnaeus had many, many detractors at the time because this was considered to be quite an appalling idea and was referred to at one point by one of his peers as awful harlotry. It was such a disgraceful thing to be putting the idea that God's beautiful productions could have sex and sexuality. Now, Linnaeus's works were groundbreaking for many, many reasons. He was, for example, the first person in Europe that we know of, along with the head gardener, to successfully flower and fruit a banana. Here we have a banana plant in front of this frontispiece for his very, very important work, Hortus Cliffordianus. And the reason this book is important is because it exemplifies a period in Linnaeus's life where he left Sweden, he traveled to the Netherlands, where he formed many long-standing personal and professional connections with Dutch botanists and scientists and other people from around Europe. But he also encountered George Clifford, who entreated him and encouraged him to come and work for him in his own personal garden and
Mark, lost you for a moment. Can you say something? Can't hear you. I think you've kicked out your... Nope. Can you hear me?
hear you. Yes, I can hear you.
Oh,
Yeah.
we can hear you now, Mark.
Oh, something, I think you have the connect. Where did you lose me at? Apologies, ladies and gentlemen.
Maybe go back.
Back to there?
No.
A little. Yeah.
Okay. Just about. Apologies, ladies and gentlemen. So this particular volume is Hortus Cliffordianus, and this work is very, very important because it exemplifies the next steps in Linnaeus's life. Firstly, this was a period in his life when he left Sweden and explored professional relationships with other scientists in the Netherlands, but he also developed his ideas and his system for creating a way of actually cataloguing and describing nature. So Hortus Cliffordianus is very important and was created during his time working with George Clifford. And Clifford asked him to create a catalogue of all of the plants growing in Clifford's very, very extensive private botanical garden. So this particular work is in structure a precursor to Species Plantarum. So at this point, I'm momentarily going to stop sharing and come to the book itself. So I've just got to remember where to go to. Go to that, and hopefully the visualizer is working. Can we all see that? That's great, thank you. So here we have under the visualizer one of the most important books in the history of science. This is Linnaeus's personal copy of Species Plantarum, the first edition, 1753. And I can assure you the very first time I held this, my knees went to jelly, because this is fundamentally important in terms of our relationship with the natural world, because it helps develop the system of science that we use today for biology. So this is his personal copy down in our taken up from our vault. And if you turn over, here we have the front title page, which I will go through in a little bit more time. As I say, this was published in 1753, some 12 years after Hortus Cliffordianus, but it encapsulates and connects with many of the ideas that Linnaeus decided he needed to do to create this naming system and method of retrieving information. Now, what makes this copy unusual, because there are other first editions of this work is that this is Linnaeus's personal working copy. He had this copy, and actually another one, interleaved with blank sheets of paper. And here you can see Linnaeus's really quite challenging handwriting. It's very small, it's very flowing, and I find it exceptionally difficult to read. I know that our head of collections, Isabelle Charmontier, is considered a bit of an expert when it comes to his handwriting. So this is the very first page. Now, what I want you to look at is actually this element here. At the front here, this actually shows how the sexual system started to work. So we have the first class, which is monandria, which means one male part. Then we have monogynia, one female part. And if you go through the class monandria, there is monandria, digynia, trigynia, etc., etc. So the very, very first plant in Linnaeus's sexual classification system, because it has one female and one male part, is the plant which we still know by this name of canna. Indian shot is another name for it. So this is canna, and if you look over on the other side, you will see just here it says indica, canna indica. So this was the nomen trivialia as Linnaeus initially described it, but it became later known as, when we formalized the naming system, as the specific epithet. So canna, the genus, indica, the species, the specific epithet. Now, I'm just going to turn over, and because I'm going to show you in a slide, because it's easier to show you in a slide what's going on with the content of this work, because this work is not illustrated. It is quite dense, very information rich text. And this is another page I'm just going to show you again, which has got further annotations. Now, the reason for this annotation, I'm going to just turn down the exposure a bit, and I can see it seems glaring a bit, is that he had these interleaved pages put on for later editions of the work. So these little sections here are where he may have changed his mind about something or wished to introduce a new species. So this work is, without a doubt, one of the most important scientific works of all time. It is up there with the works of Darwin and many others, because without this and the other works of Linnaeus, we would not have the means of keeping a grasp and understanding of the diversity of the world's biodiversity as we know it today. So I'm going to leave the screen momentarily. I've got to remember to do something else. I've got to turn off the visualize, haven't I? Oh, naughty me, wrong button. Go back to that. Go back to that and share again. And if I've been successful, that's all worked.
Excellent.
Brilliant, I did it.
Interesting, Ballet.
So just to show you in a little bit more detail what's going on with that very dense text, here we have Linnaeus's very first description of his first species in Species Plantarum, Canna indica as we now know it. So here we have the genus name, and he also, what he's doing here is not only writing a description, what we call a protologue of this species, but he's also compiling all of the information from other scientists of the time and that preceded him. So in this particular case, he's listed his preferred polynomial for this species. So in 1753, Linnaeus was essentially of the opinion the best name for this plant was Canna folis ovatis utrinque acuminatis nevosis. But he recognized it'd be quite handy to assist with his students to have the indica on the end, to just call it Canna indica. And it was this process of people actually going, you know, it's easier to say Canna indica rather than this long polynomial that led ultimately to him formalizing this as the preferred way. So that's his preferred name. What he then does is he lists and cites other publications that he thinks are relevant to understanding this name. For example, Hortus Upsaliensis, which was another of his works, and the work of Adrian van Rooyen, for example. He's also cited, not surprisingly again, another one of his works, Hortus Cliffortianus, which I mentioned again. But then he goes on to talk about other people such as the Bauhan brothers and the Bauhan's works. This is Bauhan's Pinax, and cites their polynomials as well. Underneath that, he then provides often an extremely short description of its habitat intertropicos, is fairly blunt and to the point, and also where its known distribution was at this point, Asiae, Africae, and Americanae. Now, in this particular case, we know that actually by this point, this plant was actually not native into either Africa or Asia. It was an introduction from the Americas. So by 1753, this plant from the Americas had become widely spread through the world. And not surprising, because it is still one of the most popular horticultural plants globally. Now, coming back to the specimen over here, so this is specimen number 1. From genus number 1 in the Linnean collection downstairs. You'll see at the bottom in tiny writing it says indica at the bottom here and number 1, because that is the species Plantarum number 1. So from this information we know that this object is essentially linked to this description for this species, Canna indica. So this is what we refer to as original material for the name Canna indica. So we start to build up a picture of how actually a publication can relate to physical objects. But Linnaeus' sources for information were actually very, very diverse. So in this particular case, this is another species which is from North America. You can see this is the genus Chionanthus, which is related to ash trees and also to privet and olive. It's a member of the olive family. Chionanthus virginica is one of North America's most beautiful smaller trees and shrubs. Again, Linnaeus goes through the very same process of putting his preferred name, the nomen trivialia, virginica, and citing his literature sources. But I just wanted to quickly just go through and show you actually how diverse these sources of information are, because Linnaeus was an extraordinarily brilliant compiler of information. And this is one of the things that has made him very, very useful to us if we're interested in the history of botany, is that quite often pre-Linnaean names are very, very challenging to identify, and his works can be very, very useful in unpicking them, because we can go through his publications and track back in time. So not only are these works important for the modern world, but they really do help us get a better understanding of Enlightenment biological sciences as well. So here are some of the sources for his specimens and his ideas. And here we have one of the most celebrated series of Linnaean objects. These specimens are both from the Natural History Museum, just down the road here in central London. This is from this particular one with this fabulous pot, is actually from the Clifford Herbarium, part of the collection that was made through the process of creating Hortus Cliffortianus, or some of them may have been from beforehand. So this was collected in George Clifford's garden in the 1730s, or possibly shortly before. And so this specimen is again original material because it is linked in Hawkcliffe to species Plantarum. Then we have this incredibly bedraggled specimen which tells a very sad tale. This is from Herb Clayton, but this is also actually at the Natural History Museum. And Clayton has a terrible history because he was one of the first people to create and document the flora of North America. Unfortunately, shortly after his manuscript was created, his home burnt down, and his private collections, including his own personal herbarium, were destroyed, and his manuscript and much of his wealth. Fortunately for science, he'd been sending duplicate specimens to a gentleman called Gronovius, who was a friend and benefactor of Linnaeus, and Linnaeus was able to observe these specimens to create his concept of Chionanthus virginicus. But he also used artwork. Again, from North America, Mark Catesby's incredibly important series of artworks and publications on the wildlife of North America, exemplified by many of his important depictions of birds. But in this particular case, Chionanthus virginicus again, which Linnaeus cites in that description for this species. And lastly, his own personal specimen, which he's got in the collection as well. So Linnaeus was pulling in a very, very diverse sources of information to create his understanding of what things were. Now, I'm not even sure how long I've been talking, so I'm just going to have a momentary breather to talk about actually how this really relates to the modern world. I've talked a little bit about the history in the past, but these specimens are fundamentally important to our understanding of the natural world, but also to our well-being. For various accidents of history and world society, and frankly also to a certain extent colonialism, many of the Linnean specimens are key objects in the history of global trade and commodities. So within the collections downstairs, with the 14 or so thousand specimens of Linnaeus that we look after, we have what are now called the type specimens for many incredibly important plant species. I've just picked up two. This is the type specimen for rice, and here we have the type specimen for tomato, and we have hundreds of others downstairs. So what is a type? Now, a type is a way that is a system that's been created since the beginning of the 20th century, in essence, that helps us stabilize the idea of a scientific name, such as a rhizosattva, into a physical object. And this is, in the history of biological science, it's a relatively recent innovation, because Linnaeus and his peers did not use the type concept. He cited all of his sources, publications such as Catesby's works or herbarium specimens that he'd seen. He did not choose an individual object and say, that is the one that most exemplifies or represents what I think about this idea, because these are ideas. So the development of the type specimen idea gets around some knotty problems, because increasingly in the latter part of the 19th and 20th century, we started to realize that many earlier scientific names had, when we looked at the objects and the information, multiple different types of organism embedded within them. So we needed to be able to choose an object that tied in our understanding with the original use of the name. So the type, the lect type, the physical representation of this name, has a very valuable way of stabilizing that understanding. So these type specimens help us understand what organisms are. They have value and relevance for things like international trade, because, you know, organisms that identity are disputed, it may well come down, and I'm actually working on a trade dispute at the moment, it may well come down to looking at museum specimens to validate and inform what's going on. So type specimens are incredibly important objects, not only for biodiversity, but also medicine, commerce, agriculture, etc., etc., etc. Virtually any endeavor of humanity that involves the natural world. Now I'm just going to momentarily flip again, if I can remember how to do that. Stop share. I'm going to go back to the visualizer to show you two specimens that I brought up to talk about this idea a little bit further. So now, one of the things about many Linnaean specimens is you have to bear in mind that they are rather old, and they're rather brown, and they're not very green very often. Occasionally they do, but this particular specimen, it may not look much in many respects. I'm just going to check focusing and focus that. But this actually is, oh, is the sound, sound's gone again. I've just got a note saying.
No, you're working for me.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
I think you are. I think some people have trouble with the
Yeah.
sound for some reason, but
Okay.
you're coming through.
Okay, I just saw a note flag up saying sound. So this particular specimen is something I'm looking at the moment because we've just received an inquiry about this plant. This is Liparia graminifolia, and it comes from South Africa, from the Cape region, one of the world's most diverse places for wild plants. Now, sadly, Liparia graminifolia is now believed to be extinct. and not even extinct in the wild. There's no known cultivated living specimens of this plant anywhere in the world, and it has been extinct for many, many decades. I'm just following up on an inquiry because part of my role as honorary curator is to help scientists look at the specimens, understand their history, and facilitate scientific access to these materials. In this particular case, I'm following up on an inquiry about whether this plant may have viable seed here. So this is the flower spike at the moment, which I had a quick look at under a microscope, and it is all bloom. There's no seed there, but down here at the bottom, I've had a quick look a few minutes ago, and there are some capsules there that may, with further inquiry and examination, may have seed. We don't know as yet whether that will be viable or not. So it could well be that maybe in a few years you might hear some wonderful news that this object has helped revive an extinct species. The chances are frankly remote because this has been in a cupboard for a very, very long time. And the next one I want to show you, neither of these specimens are particularly glamorous, but they are important, as are all Linnean specimens, frankly. But this one I like very much is because these two plants here are, again, type material for a very, very important plant of European origin, which is now found globally. This is fat hen, Chenopodium album. Now, fat hen is interesting because it's also what's referred to as a crop wild relative. This plant is related to quinoa, the very, very important crop of South American origin. So this plant is a crop wild relative. Now, crop wild relatives are important because these wild relatives of important plants may well have genes and genetic identity and characteristics and traits that could be very useful for us in a changing world, such as resistance to drought, resistance to extra soil salinity, because both drought and salinity are very, very important negative impacts which are going to increase and affect global agriculture. So in this particular case, again, I've just been helping some researchers from America because Chenopodium album belongs to a complicated group of plants, and they need to re-examine the original plant material to check the identity of it, to ensure that we're all on the right page and we're talking about the right organisms, because some Chenopodiums are invasive and some are crop wild relatives. So in this particular case, I've harvested some of the seed, which you can see lying loose. These are incredibly delicate. You have to be very careful. These are the seeds. These have been sent in a very small packet to America so that the researchers can study them with a microscope to help identify what's going on with this particular specimen. So our historic collections are more than just history. They are part of worldwide active science, and really, really not only part of our cultural heritage and scientific heritage and the heritage of this country, but of the world. These are objects of international importance, and we are incredibly proud to be the owners of them. But we're also incredibly grateful to the genius that is Carl Linnaeus and his wonderful collection and his extraordinary book, Species Plantarum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Great, that was amazing. Thank you. I'm glad you managed to come in. I'm sorry for everyone who has had some problem with the sound, which seems to be from the Eventbrite link rather than our Zoom link. So, okay, so we've got a few questions. Sorry, my computer's playing up. We've got a few questions in the questions Q&A box. The first one is, are there any references to plant diseases of fungal pathogens in his collection?
So Linnaeus, it's fair to say, was clearly most fabulous when it came to doing plants. The understanding of the fungal world was challenging at this point and relatively limited, partly because identifying fungi certainly requires quite high-powered microscopy, etc. And on top of that, fungi do not tend to lend themselves to being squashed flat on herbarium sheets. So Linnaeus did publish scientific names of fungi. Most of them essentially are not used today for various technical reasons, and they're actually subsumed by a different starting point, as we refer to, which I always forget the date of. So most Linnaean fungal names are now a bit of history, but we do have fungi from his collections in the Linnean Society collections. They're relatively small number, but some of those have been useful for doing current research. So we do have fungi, some of which are plant pathogens, others are just fungal organisms. We also do have quite an extensive collection of lichenized fungi, and the Linnaean lichen names are the basis of many modern lichen names. So the Linnaean lichen collections, which they form part of this series, are of significance and importance, but the true fungal, so to speak, which is a rather naughty way of describing it, has received less academic work, but we do have some.
There's a few questions. Has there been any thought to DNA barcoding each specimen in the collection?
I'd love it. It's been my fantasy league thing for around 20 years. That it would be wonderful to get a funding project off the ground to get all of the Linnaean and actually, frankly, also the Smith herbarium, which is the other collection, get them all DNA barcoded. Just for that kind of scientific curiosity, but it could be potentially incredibly powerful for sorting out some continuing ambiguities with scientific names, because my role at the Linnean Society sits on the back of the greats, my former boss, Charlie Jarvis, and preceding him, many other people, but particularly Willie Stern, who did a huge amount of work to increase and Spencer Savage, poor old Spencer Savage, naughty me for getting Spencer Savage, did a huge amount of work to help us understand the history of Linnaeus's collections. Getting the DNA bit done would be wonderful. One of the things that often surprises botanical visitors to the collection is they would imagine that we've identified all of Linnaeus's specimens. That's not the case. We have many specimens in the Linnaean collection which are in debt, indeterminate, unidentified. And therefore, on top of that, we have the legacy of the Linnaean world, which erupts out into the Smith herbarium. So in the Smith herbarium, we have many specimens from Linnaeus's son, Linnaeus Filius, who sadly didn't last many years after his father's death. But Linnaeus Filius's collections are incredibly important in their own right, because many of them originate from Banks and Solander's work with Captain Cook on the voyage on the Endeavour. So there are many, many gaps to be filled, both in terms of the identities and the DNA of these organisms.
There's lots and lots of lovely messages in the chat, actually. You have very, very nice feedback, but I don't have time to go through all that. There's another question. I know Mark will not be able to give us specific details, but I wondered if you could tell us the type of things that come up as part of a trade dispute.
Yeah. So on occasion, for example, I've had a few of these. So I suspect some people might know my other kind of work I do as a botanist is I'm a forensics investigator, where again, naming organisms is fundamentally important. Forensics would fall apart without taxonomy, or the kind of forensics I do. So one of the things that can happen, for example, is that a commodity can be contaminated with other material. And the dispute may focus on where the contaminant came from and what its identity is. So I could, for example, get sent contaminants for identification, or there's sometimes questions around people purposefully or accidentally mistrading materials. And again, this is where, you know, the science of taxonomy and the use of nomenclature comes into play, because you need to be able to stride in and save the day by helping unpicking people's understanding of scientific names. Oh, Isabel, I
Sorry,
can't. Oh,
yeah,
you're back.
no, it was me. I'd gone on mute because I was coughing. What about the idea of pangenomics, trying to capture the whole variability of a species? Does that imply type specimens may lose part of their importance?
No, one of the things I didn't touch on, because obviously it was an incredibly fast rampage through this, is that the type specimen is not necessarily the best exemplar or the most diversely representative of that idea, that scientific name. So yes, you could do pangenomics and get a very wide understanding of the genetic diversity of a population or series of populations, and therefore ergo a species or series of species. We still need that physical object to tie it to the name. And the way I often use is to think about human diversity. You know, if, for example, an alien came down from space and found us for the very first time, and they decided to use the Linnean system, you know, they might choose to bash me on the head, put me in a pickling jar, and take me off in their spaceship. I don't necessarily have all of the characteristics of humanity, but I'm a representative of human traits. So that's what a type specimen does. It doesn't cover the whole diversity, it is representative of it.
Isn't Linnaeus the type specimen for Homo sapiens? I think he was
Indeed.
proposed.
Yes, I believe Linnaeus's bones are have been considered to be the type specimen. I did briefly look that up, but then the PDF wouldn't open for some reason. It's very annoying. There is a PDF on there talking about Linnaeus's bones and his type status.
I think he was proposed to be type specimen by William Stern.
I think so.
I might be wrong. Someone else says, I'd be interested to see the list of his species and hosts. I'm not quite sure I understand that question.
So species-wise, I mean, presumably is that follow on from the fungal?
No, it's on its own.
I think it's about pathogens.
Yeah, probably.
Sorry, say that again, Padma, I didn't hear that.
I think it's about pathogens.
Okay, yeah, I think it is. Yes, I mean, so the best place to get information about Linnean names in a book form is just reaching across. Apologies, it's back to front. This is the work of my predecessor and marvelous former boss, Charlie Jarvis, Order Out of Chaos, because this details all of the Linnean plant names and fungi and algae for that matter. There is also online, there is the project that was run around this, which is called the Linnean Plant Name Typification Project. It's fair to say that the compiling and getting your head around scientific names is still an ongoing process. We're still going from the period of, you know, paper publications and literature to an online resource. So there are several very, very valuable international resources for information on Linnean and other early names. Plant Name Typification Project website, but also a thing called Tropicos from Missouri Botanic Garden, or Q's Plants of the World, just to name a couple of them. It's quite a large and complicated topic, as you can imagine.
There's another 2 questions. Greetings from Beijing, China.
Oh!
Thanks very much for such a great talk. I would be interested to know if the practice of nomenclature in Species Plantarum is really consistent with Linnaeus's statement in Philosophia Botanica or Critica Botanica.
Oh.
It seems to me that the latter 2 books make some overly restrictive requirements. Now
there's some very considered and probably thoughtful questions that I'm not sure I'm capable of answering, to be honest. I haven't actually read Philosophia Botanica for years. So I think, yeah, it's fair to say that, you know, the book, I think date-wise, they were published quite early on in his career as well. They're quite tight constructions. And yes, they probably do have a certain degree of prescriptiveness about them. I don't know whether anybody's ever really done a full critique analysis about the relationship between the collections and those works. I think it would be a complex and very, very interesting thing to do. I don't know how easily it would be to be funded, for example, in this country. But the other thing you have to bear in mind is that the Linnean collections are, whilst they're largely intact, they did suffer very significant damage. And so we know that after his death, this collection was put in the garden shed in Hammarby for a while, where it suffered damage. And his son, when he was able to get access to it, actually threw away quite large quantities of material that was severely damaged. So some of the intellectual structure that Linnaeus may have had has probably been lost. It's also fair to say that the subsidiary materials around that, such as the collections at Uppsala that he was working on and other sets of material, have gone through quite major change. You know, the important Linnean collections at the Natural History Museum as well. So it might be a bit of a stab in the dark to see how well you could actually look at the relationship between those publications and the herbariums. But it's a fascinating collection, and really nice to hear from somebody from Beijing. I was just going to say momentarily, hello again. And I fell in love with Yunnan a few years ago. So yes, love to be there again.
We've got quite an international audience, actually, Mark. There's people from Taiwan, New Zealand, US, Canada, Italy,
Cool.
Spain. It's really lovely.
Brilliant.
There's one question left, and the person apologizes about the question because I have no deep knowledge in botanical and taxonomical study, but I don't think you should apologize because that's what books are for. So he asks, because of the advance of taxonomic system, how conservative the species scientific names that described by Linnaeus compared with the current species scientific names?
That's not a naive or simple question at all. In fact, again, that's got a lot of layers of complexity in it. One thing is you have to bear in mind is that nomenclature, the act and the process or the technique of naming an organism, is not quite the same as the taxonomy, which is, you know, the philosophical processes and the intellectual processes and the information synthesis process that creates an understanding of what natural diversity is. You know, is it a species or not, which in itself is an interesting, complex question. So one of the things fair to say is, you know, if you take that complex idea and strip it down, a lot of Linnaeus's generic and species concepts have stood the test of time, both in terms of their utility on a day-to-day basis for communicating what organisms are. The fact that, you know, his scientific name Fuchsia is now just a garden plant named Fuchsia says an enormous amount about that utility. So his taxonomic concepts in many ways have stood the test of time, and on quite a few occasions they've resurfaced 200 or so years later, when afterwards people have gone, oh no, Linnaeus got it wrong, and then the DNA comes along and they go, actually he got it right. So one of the things about the DNA revolution is that it has helped clarify and expand upon that core knowledge and way of looking at the world that people like Linnaeus and his peers, because again, a bit like Darwin, or we tend to think of both Darwin and Linnaeus as being unitary kind of people who just function in their own special sphere. And yes, they were extraordinary people, but they were part of a really, really diverse community of scientists working on these understandings. So yeah, the sexual system went, but he kind of guessed that would anyway. He states that was, you know, that was probably desirable, but the binomial is here to stay.
Actually, two more questions have come in. Sorry. Hello from the Philippines.
Hello, land of Georg Camel. Yay.
This is kind of a random question, but do you have any techniques in mind upon how to easily understand the whole taxonomic system?
God!
The person is struggling to study biology. So she wants some.
My gosh. I think the most important thing, and I think, you know, it's just a thing about how we relate to the natural world, is don't rush in. Spend time observing. I think one of the greatest contributions of Linnaeus in many ways was his observational skills. You don't actually necessarily need to put a name or a descriptor or a rationale on something initially, the act of observing very slowly and very carefully is so fundamentally important. You know, one of the things I always try and get beginners to do, and I'm guessing you're not a beginner, but for people, even experienced people, as human beings, we're terrible at looking at things quickly and thinking we've not understood. Getting a times 10 hand lens and looking at a plant and really getting to grips with its personality, looking at how the flower's structured, how the leaves are structured, where the hairs are, that helps you understand the organism. And through that process, you then start to build the connections. But, you know, the natural world is very complex and very large, and it takes patience.
That's lovely. Thank you, Mark. And the last question is, are there any great children's books on the life of Carl Linnaeus?
Oh,
my daughter's name is Linnea, after the Swedish flower. So I've got one for you, which I'm putting.
Thank you, Isabel. Yes, I think that there is something, isn't there? Yeah.
It's called Carl, Get Out of the Garden. There might be some others around, but that's the one that's come to me. I can't think of anything else. And I think that's it, actually. So I'm going to end this with someone who said, Mark's enthusiasm is contagious, and I agree. So thank you so much, Mark. This has been really, really fantastic talk. Thank you for joining us direct from the Linnean Society in Piccadilly, and thank you everyone for joining.
Apologies, can I say something really quickly? So I suspect this is a very diverse community of scientists and non-scientists, but we are a very friendly and open organization. If you have an interest in our history, our collections, our specimens, or our artwork, contact us. And for scientists in particular, please have a look at our pages. And if you recognize anything and you can give us names or would like to do DNA research on us, let us know. On us, I mean our specimens, not DNA research on us. Apologies.
No, that's a good point. And I'm putting in right there the link to our online collections where all the specimens, manuscripts, books have been digitized and can be browsed freely online. And thank you again, Mark. Our next Linnean Lens will be on a book of painting of birds on mica from India by Henry Nolte, and this will be, I think it's the 14th of December. And that's it. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining.